I'm going to talk about the epistemological problems of economics. So I recommend reading the book by Mises, Epistemological Problems of Economics. That seems like an appropriate book. And also the first 130 pages about that of human action. This is, usually people find this the most difficult part of human action. So naturally, that's why they gave me this topic. They always give me the ones they don't want to give anybody else. All right, now actually, though, the lecture today will be in large part it will be very similar to Roderick Long's lecture on praxeology. I hope you don't mind that I'm going over some of the same stuff, because as I say, this is most people find this rather difficult to grasp. So it's I think it's helpful to go over some of the material again. Now, as you remember, Mises' praxeology is a deductive science of human action. So one thing before getting into how Mises, what Mises means by this and how he develops it, I think it's interesting to ask the question, where did the idea of a deductive science come from? Where do we get the idea that science proceeds in a deductive way? And here, I think an important source, I'm not sure how much this directly influenced Mises himself, is from Aristotle. If we look at the posterior analytics, Aristotle says that we start in a science, proper science starts with the first principles, which he calls archae, first principles. And so from that you deduce the whole body of the science. As if the science is properly developed. You might not always be able to get to that stage, but this is the ideal. So you see, this is very much the same as what Mises has, that you start with your axiom of action, the axiom that human beings act, and then you deduce the whole body of the science from that. It's a very Aristotelian idea. Now, there's one way I think I can't prove this is the case, but it seems to be very likely how this influenced Mises, how this ideal of a science influenced him in developing his own views, is in the legal system, in European legal system as opposed to English and American law. The European system is based on Roman law. In Roman law, it proceeds in this deductive fashion. So remember, Mises' degree at University of Vienna was in law. That was his what he got his degree in, Doctor of Civil and Canon Law. And although he of course took other courses besides law, he definitely did take law courses. So you have this ideal of a deductive science in Roman law that he developed. And even further along those lines, the greatest legal theorist at the time was his fellow student. They were lifelong friends, Hans Kelsen, who was an extremely influential legal theorist. And I'll put his name down. Hope this thing writes. Sometimes they don't. In Hans Kelsen's yes, this is, you see, this is why Walter has an endowed chair. In Hans Kelsen's what's called the pure theory of law, that he was the most influential system in European legal theory, you have a fundamental norm of the legal system, and the whole body of the legal system is derived from the fundamental norm. So you see the same pattern that you have in praxeology, you have in the Kelsen system. It's in Roman law, it's also in Aristotle. So Mises wasn't, he didn't just get this idea out of nothing. Of course, he also thought that previous economists had proceeded in a deductive way. He had such Nassau Senior and David Ricardo had argued deductively, but they didn't have so much the idea that you derive the whole science from one or just a few axioms and get the whole science deductively this way. So that's more of a Roman, something from Aristotle and the European legal system, I think. Incidentally, Kelsen was the best man at Mises' wedding, and I think they had some contact. They both wound up in the United States after the Nazis took over Austria in March 1938. Kelsen was a professor of law at Berkeley University for a long time. Now, before we get into the details of the way Mises develops the science, I think one problem I want to raise is how is the deductive method of Mises different from the way economics is developed by some of the neoclassical economists today? Say we find in some of the great neoclassical economists like Kenneth Arrow or Gerard Debreu, you have this, you start off with certain axioms and then you develop the science deductively. So one could ask, is what Mises is doing really different from what these neoclassical economists is doing? They seem to be developing things in a very deductive way also from certain axioms. So what are the differences between the way Mises develops praxeology and this kind of very standard method of proceeding among neoclassical economists? I think this is a good way of getting into the distinctive praxeological approach of Mises. Now, I think there are two key differences. One is in mathematical economics, the axioms that you start with can be really any ones you want that you think are convenient to develop your system. But Mises is starting with an axiom he considered that's self-evident, that can't be doubted, that human beings act. When we say incidentally something is self-evident, it means that knowing that it's true isn't derived from something else. It isn't that you say something is self-evident because when you look at it you have some sort of feeling of certainty. So you say, well, because I have this feeling that it's certain, therefore I'm accepting it. If you said that, then the axiom wouldn't be self-evident because you'd be deriving it from your feeling of certainty. You'd say, whenever I have this feeling of certainty about some proposition, then I'm going to accept it. So this is a proposition human beings act I feel certain about, therefore I'm going to accept that one. See, that wouldn't be self-evident. You're deriving it from this feeling of certainty plus the notion that anytime you have this feeling of certainty about something, you should accept it. See, self-evident just means you're not deriving it from something else. So the difference there is Mises starts with something that's self-evident. It isn't that you're choosing the axioms arbitrarily or what's convenient for the way you develop the discipline, but you're starting with something that's true. And so if you start with something that's true and then deduce other propositions validly from it, then you're guaranteed that what you'll end up with is true. In the if you do it the other way, where you just start with certain axioms arbitrarily, then you're not guaranteed that the results are true. And in fact, what the neoclassicals do is after they start with their axioms and then they develop various consequences of them, then they have to test whether these consequences are true, and that will if they're not, then they'll just have to change their system and come up with something else. They're trying to come up with models that fit experience. And in the praxeological way of proceeding, you don't have to do the testing because you've started with an axiom that is true, and you do something valid propositions from it. Now, the other main difference between praxeology and the current neoclassical approach has to do with how the deduction takes place. In the neoclassical way of proceeding, the deduction is it usually uses mathematics. It's a purely formal kind of reasoning. By that I mean you're not concerned at each stage in the proceedings with what the meaning of the proposition is. You just have, say, you start with something that you've expressed, say, just in symbols, and then you apply certain fixed rules to those and get an answer. Let me just give you a very simple example. This is about all the math I can handle, so I won't. Suppose you just have something like this. X plus 3 equals okay, let's say you have this 2x plus 3 equals 15. Now see, then I can apply certain mechanical rules just to come up with an answer. You know, I get something. Let's see if I can still do these. This is a tough one. So we get 2x equals 12, and then x equals 6. Oh, yes. This is a. That was. Yeah, they say Austrians can't do math. All right. So now you see, when I did this, I just applied certain rules mechanically to do it. I didn't have to really, as long as I know the rules, I just applied. There's really no room for argument. People can't say, no, you shouldn't have done it this way, you should have done something else. It's just certain fixed rules that I apply. So what the neoclassicals have the view that this is the ideal of reasoning. In this way we can eliminate disagreement. We just apply certain fixed rules mechanically. This was an ideal in philosophy, very prominent at the beginning of the 20th century, where Bertrand Russell had this view. You can see he was an extremely influential philosopher. He thought that because philosophers had always argued with each other, nobody had ever been able to come up with a system that was acceptable to everybody, to all philosophers. You just have disagreements over different systems. So he thought, well, one way, what we can do to eliminate these disagreements is instead of reasoning in ordinary language, what we should do is try to construct an ideal symbolic language. Of course, he was one of the great pioneers in developing symbolic logic, and he thought that if we could state our propositions in symbolic form and then just reason by following certain formal rules, we could eliminate all disagreement. We'd be able to show what the solutions to the problems are, or on the other hand, we'd be able to show that certain questions weren't properly formulated in the first place, so they wouldn't be genuine problems. If you had purely formal reasoning, you'd be able to eliminate this disagreement. You also find this ideal earlier in the great 17th century philosopher Leibniz. And Leibniz said, if an ideal language were developed, we'd be able to end disagreement. So if we had a disagreement, he said, we would say, gentlemen, let us calculate. We wouldn't have to have any arguments about disputed matters anymore. Now, in praxeology, Mises doesn't do that at all. The reasoning is in ordinary language, and it's informal. It doesn't follow fixed rules. For example, you remember after Mises says human beings act, then he says, well, what does an action involve? It's the use of means to achieve ends, and then he goes on to say all sorts of things about relations of means and ends. Say we rank our ends in a certain order, and we'll choose our most highly valued end if among those is the one to do. When he's reasoning in this way, when he's developing consequences of the action axiom, he isn't at all going by purely formal rules. He isn't setting out certain symbols and then say, well, just like you can, if you subtract the same number from each side of the equation, you'll come up with this. You'll still have an equation that's, you'll still have something that's balanced. You don't do that in praxeology. You have to think out at each step, is this something reasonable to do based on your own understanding of what it is what is involved in an action. So in the Misesian way, you have meaning at each step. You're not following mechanical rules. So now, excuse me, now having given some of the differences between Mises and the neoclassicals, I want to now give what are some of the, go into more detail on how Mises proceeds. What exactly is involved in his praxeological way of reasoning. Now, I want to deal first. He has some very important assumptions called methodological individualism. I'll erase the advanced math here.
David, can you tell us a joke regarding methodological individualism?
Well, there were two methodological individualists who walked into a bar. I remember one story. There was actually one joke. There was a man who walked into a bar, and the person standing next to him said, "Oh, I didn't see it either." All right. So methodological individualism. Again, now to see that this is true is we have to think about things. It isn't we're not able to deduce from the view that human beings act, that methodological individualism is true. We have to think about this. What this assumption is that only individuals act. Say if we don't have groups, that if you say group acts, this is just in a non-literal sense, or I shouldn't say non-literal, that wouldn't be the best way to put it. If you say a group acts, it's reducible in some ways to the action of individuals. For example, suppose we say the United States is waging war on Iraq now. So how is this to be analyzed? Well, it's that President Bush gave certain orders to various people, and as a result of that, there are American soldiers who are doing various actions in Iraq. It isn't that there's a whole separate entity, the United States, that acts apart from the individuals. This is fairly non-controversial. There are people who've denied it. For example, there was an American philosopher, early 20th century, Josiah Royce, who thought that, I think he thought that animal species, a whole species of animals could act separately. So it seems an odd view to hold. It's hard to find people who would deny it, but there have been some people. For example, one who did deny the view was an enemy of an old academic enemy of Mises named Ottmar Spahn. Let me put him down. I don't have any jokes about him. Well, actually, I did have one. If you wanted, I remember there was a story Hayek used to tell when I had him in his class. He said Spahn had some system of diagrams where he would show one. He had two circles, and you'd have lines going from one circle to another. So he said when Spahn was putting this on the blackboard and he had his back turned, people in the class would put their hands over their head, making fun of him. But so Spahn held, though, that group action is prior to the individual action. So if you have two, there's a we who are acting, two individuals who are acting, and the individual actions are derivable from the we rather than the group. Then, as the praxeologist would say, it seems very commonsensical that group action is reducible to individual action, is derivable from action of individuals. Spahn had matters reversed, as he very often did. Now, just mention a couple misunderstandings of methodological individualism. In a very important article called on Austrian Methodology by the great philosopher Robert Nozick, thinks that methodological individualism is the view that group action is not only reducible to the action of individuals, but it's reducible to the action of just a few individuals. So all group actions have to be explainable just by reference to actions of a few people. And I think he's wrong about this. It's just the denial, methodological individualism is just the denial of the notion of collective minds or groups. It doesn't involve this additional assumption. Maybe Nozick was thinking the other one's so obvious that you wouldn't need to state it as a separate principle, but he does say that he has this additional thing. I should also mention Walter Block, who's here, has a long article replying to Nozick's criticisms of Austrian methodology. So I think if you read Nozick's article, you should also read Walter's article as well. They're kind of a very interesting interchange. Now, the last misunderstanding about methodological individualism I want to mention is is a criticism of the view that I just said, that very few people deny methodological individualism. Tibor Machan, who's a libertarian philosopher some of you may have heard of, once said to me that this is wrong. I shouldn't say that very few people challenge methodological individualism, because he said, well, look, there's a movement in political theory now called communitarianism, and they deny this view. But I don't think Tibor is right on this point. He's usually wrong on things, as a matter of fact. So what the communitarians say is that the individual identity is constituted by their relationships of various sorts. What you are is in large part constituted by, say, what society you're in or what your relationships with various people are. But that's a different view from denying methodological individualism. They don't say that groups are acting separately. They just have rather unusual views of how individual identity is constituted, but their views don't involve the view that groups act apart from individuals. So I think it's still right to say that methodological individualism is fairly uncontroversial. Now, another assumption Mises makes is methodological singularism. Let me put this down. Put this. Oh. This is of singular importance. All right, what this means is that it's very important in understanding how Mises develops praxeology. What he says is you take any action you want, can be anything you want, and then you eliminate all the details that make it one particular action rather than another. Like we'll say, I'm now lecturing. Well, I just eliminate anything special about my now giving a lecture. I just consider the structure of the action, like the form of any action. You start with any action you want. You just eliminate all the particular features, and then you say the action, what is involved in any action as such, and this is how you develop praxeology, just by considering the features of an action. Now, I now want to say something, again, Roderick discussed this in his lecture, I want to go over. It's not only praxeology is not only a science of action, it's an a priori science of action. I want to go over what does it mean to say that a statement is a priori. This is one, an a priori proposition is one that can be known apart from experience. Now, it's something, in other words, that we can know it's true just by thinking about it. Now, important to see that the key thing is here in determining whether proposition is a priori is how we know it's true. It isn't at all about how we come to understand the proposition. Somebody could hold the view that we don't have any understanding of propositions apart from experience. Somebody could say we don't have any concepts unless we first acquire them through experience. That was perfectly consistent with holding their a priori truth. It's just a matter of once you've got the proposition, how do you know it's true? Do you have to, can you just think about it and see it and realize it's true, or do you have to test it out? Do you have to see, is this the case or not? Could it be false? If it could be false, then it's not a priori. You'd have to see whether you have to do various things to find out if it's true. Now, you remember when I just gave this this definition, I said it's something that can be known apart from experience. You see, it isn't that something is known apart from experience, but it can be. I mean, suppose, for example, we have some kind of very complicated mathematical theorem. Suppose somebody said, well, you have in your algebra textbooks, I remember back in the old days when I was learning this, we had the binomial theorem. This is something that's, if it's true a priori, but I could say I could know it's true just because I learned it from my math textbook. That's perfectly consistent with it being a priori. Even see, I learned it just because I know it's true because, say, it's in the math textbook, and I believe I have good reasons for thinking whatever's in the that math textbook is true. That's consistent with being a priori because one could know it just by thinking about it, even though I didn't. So it's just something is a priori. If you couldn't, you can know it apart from experience. Yeah, a joke. Let's see. Oh, that's a tough one. Well, I don't have any a priori jokes right now. But if one comes to mind, you'll be the first to hear about it. Probably the last also. So All right, so that's what the a priori one is, one that can be known apart from experience. Now, this has to be these have to be distinguished, and it's very important. There's an outstanding American philosopher, some people rank him the top philosopher in the world, Saul Kripke, who book Naming and Necessity very much emphasizes. There's a big distinction between saying something is a proposition is a priori and saying it's necessary. A necessary proposition is one that has to be true. Things couldn't be otherwise than it states. For example, suppose I say, I'm now lecturing. This isn't a necessary proposition because it could have been false. I might not have been lecturing. I might not have given this lecture. Probably you would all prefer it had that been true. At least I would prefer it. But it's not a necessary proposition. Whereas we could say, suppose we say, water is H2O. At least according to Kripke, that's a necessary true proposition. It couldn't have been false that water is H2O. So the key point to understand here is that the distinction, when you say a priori truth, this is a matter of epistemology. It's how we know something is true. And the other one, the necessary propositions are concerned with what is metaphysics, what actually is the case. It's not about how we know things, it's about what is the case. Now, interesting question is, are all a priori truths necessary ones? Could you have an a priori truth, that's say something we can know apart from experience that isn't necessary, that could have been false? And it seems that we can. For example, suppose I take the statement, I exist. Well, this could have been false. It could have been that I didn't exist. It could have been, it's not a necessary proposition that I exist. But I can know this to be true just by thinking about it, since if I'm thinking about it, then I do exist. So it is an a priori proposition that's not necessary. Another example is, suppose we start with a standard a priori proposition, 2 plus 2 equals 4. This is a necessary one also, but let's take the second one. I know that 2 plus 2 equals 4. That one I can know to be true apart from experience. I realize not only that 2 plus 2 equals 4, but I know that I know this. But that isn't necessary either. I mean, I could have been even more mathematically illiterate than I am and not know that to be true. So that isn't necessary either. Now, I've spent a good deal of time on the a priori, but now, having done that, we have to raise the question, is praxeology, or is all of praxeology a priori? There's some question about this, because Mises, in addition to the action axiom, which he considers an a priori truth, he puts in other axioms as well, such as one that there's a variety of goods and services. Another one is that labor has disutility. People in general don't want to labor. There can be various kinds of work you enjoy doing, but in general we regard laboring as a cost. And these aren't a priori truths. These are ones that are just, if he's right, are true, but they're not ones we could know apart from experience. I mean, it could have been the case that everybody enjoys working 24 hours a day or as close to that as possible, but it just turns out that isn't right. So if you have these extra axioms in, it would seem that the parts of praxeology that involve these axioms are not a priori. So does this mean that at least part of praxeology isn't an a priori discipline? Well, I think what Mises could reply to that is he could just make those parts of praxeology conditionally could say, if these axioms are true, then such and such follows, and that would be a priori. You could always, very often, if you have, you can conditionalize a proposition and get out of difficulty that way. When in doubt, conditionalize. Walter, very good. Yeah, well, I should say for Walter's benefit, that was a joke. All right, so I now want to go into, in the little time remaining, the attacks on praxeology from the logical positivists. You remember Roderick had something to say about those in his lecture. And what I want to concentrate on is some of them not only developed their particular doctrines about philosophy, but they had attacks on praxeology. In particular, Felix Kaufmann, who was a member of the Vienna Circle, the main group of logical positivists, and also was a student of Mises and attended his seminar, developed some criticisms of praxeology based on logical positivist views. Kaufmann got around. He was also a member of a phenomenology circle. He was the leading expert on phenomenology, which was another philosophical movement at the time, and he was an important legal theorist also. So he seemed to move around in a lot of different circles. I should say, if you'll allow me a digression, the logical positivist movement illustrates some of the dangers of academic life. The founder of the group was the Moritz Schlick. I'll put him down. Not to be confused with the razor brand. Schick razors is the Schlick.
Roderick has a slick joke. I just said he was a pretty slick customer.
Yes, that's so funny I can't give the rest of my talk. Well, what happened was Schlick had a student who he failed on his Ph.D. exams. It was, I think the man's name was Nelbach, and this student also thought that Schlick he was involved with a woman that he was also interested in. It's unclear that he was. So he did Nelbach did what anyone would do in that situation. He came into Schlick's office and shot him dead. He was put on trial and put in jail. And then when the Nazis took over Austria in March 1938, he was eventually pardoned. He was a member of the Austrian Nazi Party, and he claimed that he was helping to rid the University of Vienna of Jewish influence. Now, a problem with this statement was Schlick wasn't Jewish, but in any event, he was pardoned. I think he wound up as a forest ranger. But so, as I say, so you have to be very careful if you're in academic life, especially if you're a logical positivist. And so remember the positivist view is that all meaningful statements are either analytic, which is really saying they're definitions or parts of definitions or tautologies that don't give you any information about the world, or empirical statements, one where some observation is relevant to their truth. For example, if I say I'm lecturing now, this is an empirical statement because you make the observation that I am lecturing, and so that statement is verifiable. So what the logical positivist said is, if, as Mises said, you claim that you know these various propositions economics a priori, you claim you know them without testing, then they just must be simply true. They're just statements of certain definitions or parts of definitions, and they're just, in a sense, what Mises is doing is playing with words. He's just coming up with a certain conceptual structure and saying, well, this is this is praxeology, this is science of action. He's just elaborating on the consequences of definitions that he's chosen, and then it's a question that isn't resolvable without testing whether this applies to the world or not. Now, this is a bit abstract, but let me give you an example of one of Kaufman's criticisms of Mises. Remember, one of the basic principles in praxeology, I'm sure you heard this in some of the other lectures, is that someone always chooses his most highly valued end. You take the various actions available to you at a particular time, and then you'll rank them in order, and you'll pick the one, you'll do the one you rank highest. And Mises claims this is something we know just by thinking about the concept of action, what's involved in a particular action. We see this is always true. So what Kaufman says is, well, what Mises is doing here, he's just defined the most highly valued action as the one we actually choose. So when he says we always choose our most highly valued action, he's just in effect saying we always choose the one we do choose. He isn't saying anything that gives any new information about the world. He's just defined the most highly valued choice in a way that statement has to come out true. He isn't really telling us anything. He's just saying we choose whatever it is we do choose. So this shows that this is an example showing that the praxeology, this principle of praxeology is just a tautology. It isn't telling us anything. So is this criticism right? Well, as you'll not be surprised to find out, I don't think that it is a good criticism. It isn't at all, but Mises has defined the most highly valued end as the one we choose. By most highly valued end, he just means that in an ordinary sense. He's thinking we rank our ends in a certain order, and we have one that's ranking highest. That isn't that. In thinking about that, that doesn't say anything at all about which one you choose. And then he's saying once you rank those, then you'll choose the highest one. That's the one you'll pick. So it isn't that he's saying he's defined it in such a way that it's going to be. It turns out true. He's saying when you think about this, you'll see that it is true. If then the positivists say, well, how do we know it's true? It's just that you think about it, and just based on your own understanding of action, do you think it's true? One indication, I should say, that it isn't a tautology, isn't just something it's true just because people define it a certain way. There are people who deny this view. That they hold. It's called. People say there are cases of so-called weakness of will, where we rank a certain end highest, but we choose something else. And there's a Greek term akrasia that's used for this. So there are philosophers who advocate what's called the notion of strong akrasia. And so if you held that view, then you'd be denying this principle of praxeology. The way a praxeologist would cope with cases like this, suppose you said something that, well, I think I shouldn't drink because alcohol has very bad effects on me, but I have very strong temptation to drink now, so I do drink. So some people would say, well, that's a case where you really don't want to drink because you really rank highest and not to drink, but you wind up drinking anyway, so you're not choosing your most highly valued end. Now, the praxeologist would explain this in a different way. He might say, well, you had that as a general policy not to drink, but this particular time, that wasn't your most highly valued end. You really did want to drink then. That was your most highly valued end. But it isn't, so that's a real controversy in philosophy. It isn't just a matter of definition. So the Mises then, the Misesians have a reply to these logical positivist criticisms. I should say, and then I think I'll have the rest of the time for questions, Mises held the view not only that the logical positivists were wrong, but he thought that the logical positivists, the whole logical positive movement, or at least one of the chief motives of the whole movement, was to attack economic theory. One of the most important people in the Vienna Circle was a philosopher and did other things well named Otto Neurath. I dropped something there. Well, he was also, you see, besides being a logical positivist, he was also involved in the Austrian socialist government in the early 1920s. So, and he criticized Mises' socialist calculation. So Mises held the view that one of the reasons the positivists had this very strict view of meaning is they wanted to eliminate economic theory because many of them, such besides Rudolf Carnap and others, were socialists, and they found economic theory very inconvenient for what they wanted to do. So Mises says he has this very in Ultimate Foundation of Economic Science, which was his last major book. He thought that the positivist movement was in some part directed against his method of procedure. Now, this is someone, it wouldn't show, even if he's right, it doesn't show that what the logical positivists are saying is false, but he does have, I think, a related, very good argument against the positivists. He said, well, look, if they say this is a certain criteria, meaning you have to look, they say they want to be scientific, you have to examine what is actually going on in science, and in doing that, you can't neglect at the economics. He said if the positivists really wanted to say they wanted to be scientific, they should have looked at what economics is actually doing, and then they would see there's a type of reasoning that they did, a type of proposition they really hadn't allowed with. Now, I'll finish, since Walter asked for Joe, there was one funny story about Neurath, that he thought a lot of the people in the Vienna Circle were too metaphysical, and whenever anyone started in the discussions they would have would start making a statement he considered metaphysical, he would just make a buzzing noise while this was going on. Sometimes he would be buzzing the entire meeting. So, all right, well, I think we'll now have any questions, objections. Yeah.
When you talk about axioms and saying that it would be self-evident, but what about language? Aren't they kind of contingent on the idea of on language?
Oh, well, I mean, it's certainly the case. I mean, you have to state things in language, but that doesn't have to do, I don't think that would really affect whether something is self-evident. I don't see how something could be a proposition at all if it weren't expressed in language, but how would that make it contingent? Are you thinking something like this? Well, the various words and rules of language are contingent themselves. They didn't have to be that, so that somehow makes anything that uses language contingent. Well, I don't think, if that's what you mean, I don't think that would follow. It's once we have a language, then this allows us to state certain propositions that are a priori. It's only the fact that the particular words we use could have had other meanings doesn't sort of radically infect our propositions with contingency. At least I'm not clear why it would. Walter?
Yeah, I have a question. It has to do with singularism.
Mm-hmm.
My understanding that happens correctly. That at any time, any one given action is either picking or setting aside.
Mm-hmm.
It's very simple.
Mm-hmm.
Which, in my interpretation, again, perhaps incorrect, means that the demand curve
Mm-hmm.
is illegitimate because it isn't limited to one or the other. It's got a whole bunch of choices. Or, put it another way, Menger and Rothbard have these lists of 1 ounce of gold, 1 horse, half an ounce of gold, a half a horse, things like that, where they have these hierarchies.
Mm-hmm.
Would that be incompatible with singularism in the sense that singularism sort of puts focus, a narrow focus on, picking something and setting aside everything else?
Well, I don't think it would, you see, because ordering a preference isn't that's just an order, that isn't a particular action. It would certainly be right that when you're acting, you're choosing one thing rather than another, but that's perfectly consistent with having an order of goods and saying, I'm picking, this is at the top of my list, so I'm picking that. That's an example. Say if you had a whole list and you say, I'm picking this one because that's the top one, that would be an example of picking one rather than anything else on the list. You see, that would just be an example of picking one thing rather than another. It certainly wouldn't exclude you from thinking of having a whole lot of having a whole series of preferences in your mind. I don't see why it would.
But that whole series of preferences is, strictly speaking, incompatible with action. Action is,
Mm-hmm.
you just do one thing.
Oh, right, well, right, but I mean, the list of preferences doesn't purport to be an action itself, so there's no incompatibility. I mean, if you were saying somebody's acting somehow on all the preferences at once, it might.
If one was worried to do something like this, which is, there's a sense of preference in which you just have to sort of raise wishes you have and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
There's also a sense of preference in the praxeological sense, of preference that's expressed in action. I guess Walter's worry is, can you express a ranking of multiple items in action, or can you only express a ranking of one over all the others in action?
Oh, yeah, I don't think you'd be expressing the preferences for anything else than what you do in the action. That's perfectly right. But it isn't when you, I think this is helping me give the response I want. When you have a list of preferences, you're not expressing these preferences in action. It's just you have the preferences, but you're not. So it's,
There's a sense of preference,
yeah.
there's a praxeological sense, but it only exists
Yeah.
as far as it's embodied in action. So in that sense of preference, I guess the worry is,
Mhm.
could there really be a multiple ranking of preferences in that sense?
in that sense, I don't think there could be. I mean, there wouldn't be. I mean, but in that sense, let me see. So you'd be doing this. Yeah, I mean, in that sense, I think all you could say is that the person is acting in a certain way. I mean, you say you know that he's doing this rather than anything else, but I don't think you'd be able to specify what is included in the rather than anything else. So I think that's a good point. Yeah. Yeah.
I have a question for Lewis. There's a mention statement, even though there is not perfect, even though there's something not realistic, but on the line of fact, we can use statistical analysis to use experiments and after with quiet search. So what's the response?
Well, what Mises thinks there is that statistical analysis would just be useful in applying economic theory to history. For example, you could come up with various statistics, say, on what the demand for a certain product had been at various times, and you could say you might draw certain curves on showing how the demand had varied over a particular time. But this would, in the Misesian view, that would just be a historical way of doing history. It wouldn't be strictly part of economic theory. It wouldn't be part of praxeology. I think in Human Action, Mises discusses the work of Henry Schultz, who was a leading pioneer in developing demand curve statistics, and he said, well, this is just of historical interest. So it's what I think Mises would say to these people who use statistics is not that they shouldn't do that, but it isn't part of praxeology. It's not part of the theory as he develops it.
They're not saying you use statistics to prove something. They're saying I can use statistics to illustrate some idea and use statistics to see whether my theory is useful or not. I mean, I know the theory is always right. By definition, it's always right. But I can use the theory to apply to some statistics. In this instance, we're not going to know whether it's useful or not. We can match data or not. And then we can use whether we use the theory to refine or not. But if we just think about it, how can we do it?
Oh, well, that's an excellent question. I mean, what you would you just develop the theory further by thinking about it more. I mean, from the fact that statistics are useful in refining certain hypotheses, it doesn't follow that the only way you can refine a theory is through statistics. So I just think that in the Misesian system, there aren't quantitative relationships where statistics would be useful, but it doesn't follow from that Mises doesn't have other ways of proceeding that are useful. I mean, you have, it's just like in, there's certainly a priori disciplines that don't use statistics, like philosophy or other branches of mathematics, non-statistical branches of mathematics, and some of those are very well developed. So we can get along in praxeology without statistics, at least on average. Yes, Matt?
Getting back to Dr. Block's point, that when you talk about creating this list of value rankings, it's not actually making any, you're not actually talking about preference in any sense of preference, or talking about by action. So it's like this list that's like an imaginary construction. The minute that you start to list your ideas, when you really the top preference is thinking about your preferences, right?
Oh, well, I think there are several points there. If you say that you can't express a list of preferences in action, it doesn't follow that the list of preferences is imaginary. You really do have these preferences, just a different sense of preferences. Now, you're right. If someone is thinking about a list of preferences, then that's an action he's doing. But what we're concerned here is not that action, but the results of that action, namely the list of preferences. So that the fact that that itself is an action doesn't show that there isn't a list of preferences. Yes, Helena.
What does Iran think of praxeology?
Well, she had comments on it, I think, in some notebooks she wrote. She thought that Mises was too much influenced by Kant. She thought Mises had the view that we have Mises thought the reason praxeology is correct is that we have certain mental categories and we've sort of imposed this on reality. And she had a more Aristotelian approach that where she thinks that we can see actual necessities in things. It's kind of an empirical approach, but we really grasp necessities. So she thought Mises was too much of a Kantian. Of course, for her, since Kant was the worst thinker of all time, that wasn't a very good idea. Rod?
There was a recent issue of the Journal of Ayn Rand Studies that was devoted to exploitation between Ayn Rand and It's just some of the differences were phenomenological. So.
Yes, I think I think if you, especially if you, if you take account of some of this recent stuff with the, I was mentioning with Kripke on necessity, you can fit in. It had some interesting parallel. I think you point out with Rand, you can fit this into a praxeological approach in a very interesting way. I think just one more question. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to think everyone gets too much longer, but I did a clarification I wanted to make in that dispute. You did say that the knowledge of human action, our knowledge of human action is a priori, right?
Or at least there is knowledge of human action that's a priori. I didn't claim that all knowledge we have of human action is a priori. I mean, that there is such a thing as a priori knowledge of human action. I certainly don't rule out that there are empirical truths about human action.
You gave the example of choosing a higher order good, making a choice, then Frank Wolfman, he chose a higher order good by making that choice, right?
I did.
Huh?
Well, I'll take your word for it. I don't remember saying that.
But the reason why I said it is because the first name Green, I don't know his name. He used the word self-evident, and I think that might be a better description because it's self-evident doesn't mean it's necessarily a priori.
Oh, that's perfectly correct. I mean, you could say I did say. I think I did say in the lecture. I gave examples of. Well, did I? You could have something that's. You could certainly have a self-evident proposition that isn't a priori. I mean, I think you could. Let me see if I could. Maybe I shouldn't have said that. Could you have? Yeah.
The law of non-contradiction. They can't both exist and not exist.
Oh, but I mean that would be an a priori truth. Is something.
I
know. Oh, yes. Oh, that one. Oh, I did give one. But you see, here's the difficulty there. I gave the example. I know that 2 + 2 = 4, but it would seem like on some views, this is disputable. That is a priori true, since I know it's true apart from experience. Some people don't accept that. They think a priori truth has to be some kind of conceptual truth. So if you took that view, you'd be perfectly right. That wouldn't be a priori. But I think my highest preference now is to end the session. So we'll do that. Thanks.